Faxanadu, released in 1989 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, courtesy of Hudson Soft and part of Falcom's Dragon Slayer series of RPGS games. That last bit, I'm sure, is relevant information to someone out there somewhere. Also, I say this graced NES in '89, but Faxanadu first saw release in Japan on the family computer in 1987. It took them 2 years to localize this for North American audiences, and yet another year for Europeans to get their mitts on this thing. For further context, this game initially hit the Famicom in the same year that also saw the system graced with The Legend of Zelda 2: Link No Boken and Dracula 2: The Accursed Seal, which would later be localized to NES in 1988 as Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link and Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest respectively. I bring these two games up specifically because A. Faxanadu is often compared to these two games, and also B. Faxanadu saw release onto the NES after Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2, thus making it, from our perspective at least, the newer game. So clearly it had to be the better game, right? I mean, fuck, this guy says it is, so it must be true. Hey, don't rag on Uncle Derek. He's a good dude, he does good stuff, and he has odd tastes. But then again, don't we all, right? So, where was I? Oh, Faxanadu. So this is an action platform adventure game of sorts where you take control of a young elf, return to his home village, only to be tasked by the king to venture into the world tree and kill the dwarves that are wreaking havoc on the elves. This quest naturally involves acquiring weapons, armor, spells, and other doohickeys that you'll need to achieve your goal of exterminating the dwarf race and stuff. Faxanadu is something of a cult favorite among the old school crowd. It saw release on the old Wii Virtual Console. Some influential online personalities hold it in high regard. Hell, it even inspired an episode of that old Captain N show from ages ago that nobody's going to remember these days. But Faxanadu is a game that never really stuck with me for some reason. It's a game I bought ages ago, back when game collecting was a fun and affordable hobby and not whatever the fuck it is these days. I've heard good things about it. It's got a nice simple cover, a nice premise, often compared to the aforementioned Zelda 2 and Simon's Quest, both of which I've enjoyed quite a bit. So why haven't I given this game a proper try over the years? Lack of time maybe, but I don't know, I found time to play all these other stuff that took hours to get through, and this is a comparatively shorter game, so anyways, one day I popped this game in and, okay, look, I'm going to be real here. Revisiting Faxanadu is a bit of a struggle now, because this was the last game I played with Sasha by my side, and she would lay in her little bedding, occasionally popping up her head to see if I was done grinding. Yeah, we'll get to that. And then a couple days later, her health was starting to worsen, and, well, you know, and I still miss that dog. It still hurts to know she's no longer around even a year later, and part of that is why I put off doing a proper video on this game, because even now the wound is still fresh, and yeah, so emotional hurdles aside, excuse me. Goddamn. There was another reason why Faxanadu never really stuck with me, and that's because despite its cult status, its reverence among the crowd, and its gracing many underappreciated hidden gem listings over the years, Faxanadu doesn't exactly live up to the hype, I feel. But then here's the conundrum. Is it because it's not as good of a game that I've heard people say it is? Or is it because I played other games that did what this game did on the same console but better, and so when you get to this, it doesn't feel like the big deal that it's been hyped up to be because you've had these other experiences that were better? I don't know, it could be one, it could be the other, sometimes it may even be both. So, upon starting the game, you'll arrive at your home village and find that there are monsters invading and you have no weapons to defend yourself against. Also, you start with a pitiful amount of health as opposed to a full meter. Why this was a thing, I don't know. I guess you meet with the king, he gives you money, then you spend some of that money on healing services to help out the local economy. Or you could just get yourself killed and you'll respawn at a church fully healed, free of charge, so yeah. Actually, another thing you could do is talk to the king and he'll give you money, and then you could spend all that money on various things. And talk to the king again, he'll replay the same conversation from before, right down to giving you more money. This is something you could exploit to stock up on goods, or basically have a heads up on funds to further your adventuring needs, or something to that extent. So it's a neat little trick if you want to exploit that. Anyway, there's some mild RPG elements at play here, as you would expect. You visit towns to purchase wares, talk to townsfolk for useful information and other services. Each town also houses a church or a guru who will grant you a mantra. Mantra being another word for password. Because yes, even though this came out after Zelda 2 and its rather convenient battery backup save system, Faxanadu relies on a somewhat cumbersome password system to record your progress. Now admittedly, I've seen worse password implementation in other games, but still, 2 years to localize this thing and they couldn't be bothered to add a proper backup save system, despite the fact that the NES release was actually published by Nintendo as a first-party release for some reason, and we're still using passwords. And yes, that's how they did things back in the day. I should know, I grew up in those days, and had I played this back then, younger me would have said the same thing. Actually, younger me would have been even more salty about that. Also, not to put a finer point to it, but Dragon Quest on the Famicom started off with a password system, and when they turned that shit to Dragon Warrior for NES, they gave the game a battery backup save. So yeah, Hudson and Nintendo, who published the game around these parts and even made a push in their Nintendo Power propaganda machine, could have added a battery save to Faxanadu, but they didn't. They gave us this, and thus this video gets a minute or so of padding to talk about this one thing because... I don't know, I feel like it. I just do. I'm sorry. Anyway, so you fight monsters to earn experience points like most RPG-type games. Experience points are not used to level up in the traditional sense, but rather to determine your rank. Once you reach a certain amount of experience points, you'll need to visit one of them gurus, and they'll bestow upon you a new rank. You start off as a novice, and then as you progress, you'll earn new ranks such as veteran, swordsman, hero, and so on and so forth. The purpose of rank is not to boost your stats or make your hero strong, but rather it determines your starting amount of experience and gold whenever you continue a new game. So basically, if you die at any point, you'll restart at the last guru you visited, keeping whatever items you have attained along the way, but your experience and gold is reset back to a set amount determined by your rank. This also applies when you enter a password. The higher the rank, the higher value of experience and gold that you start a new life with. Again, this is something you could exploit because if you die dirt poor, you'll get some gold back at least, but at the same time you'll lose whatever experience you have attained beyond the set amount determined by your current rank. So it's a weird little system, but I don't know, it's something I guess. I'm not too sure about this one, but I have no real issues with it either, so... Your hero's abilities start off basic. He can swing a melee weapon of sorts, he could use a shield to block enemy projectiles, he could eventually shoot his own magic projectiles, and he could use items such as keys and potions to aid in his journey, of which he can carry like a set amount in his inventory. Your hero, however, suffers from Rockman syndrome in that he cannot crouch, and your starting dagger has trouble reaching smaller foes. You'll eventually gain better weapons and armor, but I don't know, the weapons in Faxanadu often feel flimsy and somewhat unreliable at times. Look, Zelda 2 gave you a smallish sword, and despite its short range, it's actually a pretty solid melee weapon, especially with a couple of moves added later on. And while the Vampire Killer Whip is something of an inelegant weapon at times, it does get the job done. Nice striking distance, good power, and oh yeah, your hero can crouch. And also the collision detection on those games is nowhere near as jank as they are in Faxanadu, which probably contributes to this game's not being as good as it's all hyped up to be feeling that I get with this thing. Now to be fair, the lack of crouching does become something of a moot point once you've acquired a large weapon that can strike knee-height foes with a single stab, but then there's the rare occasional period where hit detection is more of a working theory than a fact of life. But my bigger gripe is with the jumping. You have to build up some momentum to be able to clear even small gaps, and sometimes even that doesn't always work in your favor. Also, given the staggered nature of moving from screen to screen, some of which would expect you to know when to jump ahead... Faxanadu provides the player with an inventory system, one that thankfully is grouped into weapons, armor, shields, and items. Though unlike some other game where purchasing a new piece of equipment will replace the current one, you still have to equip your newly acquired wares. You can carry up to 8 items at any one time, and items do not stack. So if you decide to stack up on potions, you'll have an inventory full of potions. But potions are not the only items you'll need in this game. In addition to other things like wing boots that let you hover for a bit, or matlocks that let you smash bricks, there are different types of keys that let you enter doors. And if you enter a door, you better make sure you do everything you need to do behind that door, because if you need to enter through that door again, you'll need to use up another key because those get used up each time you enter a door, and the door relocks. Oh, and to use a key, you have to go to your inventory, select the key in question, and enter the door, assuming it's the right key to begin with. To use items, you'll need to select them items and press down and A to actually use the item. There are the little frustrations of Faxanadu that can be mildly annoying. The virtual lack of grace period after taking a hit, so you could easily be pummeled to death with a steady barrage of hits. Items and other services constantly being more expensive as you progressed farther into the game, to the point where a potion that once went for about 100 gold now values in the thousands for roughly the same value. Potions and poisons looking similar to each other, hidden items sometimes appearing after clearing a screen of enemies and sometimes not being able to wield weapons inside houses so that monsters can land a free hit on you unless you have magic spells active, among a couple other things. At the same time, however, there are a few things that Faxanadu does right. Dying might not be fun when it means losing all your experience points since your last guru visit, but at the very least you'll have enough gold to get some goods even if you were dirt broke at death's door. Citizens will provide helpful advice or perhaps just remind you of things that you may have already known. There are no worries of cryptic clues, lying liars, or ignorant fools. People will tell you what you need to succeed because they want their suffering to end. And since you can't actually kill anyone, this is their only means of getting it, is for you to solve the mystery of the world tree and kill it or something, I don't know. Sometimes the next leg of your journey is as simple as finding the key to the next dungeon. Sometimes it's more involved, like using elixirs to get fountains up and running so you could access the next section of the world tree. There's rarely, if ever, the need for backtracking. Hell, if you're willing to grind for a few coins, you could get the powerful death projectile fairly early in the game and never really look back. And while there are some questionable design choices here and there involving jumping or some mild mechanical quirks, there never comes a point where Faxanadu feels obscenely unfair. Sometimes you just need to grind for a bit to build some bank for needed items or to upgrade equipment. Faxanadu suffers from a beginning portion that demands the player put up with some quirks that range from mild annoyances to genuinely irritating. Once you build yourself up to a more tolerable level, the game does feel somewhat more manageable. Somewhat. Faxanadu is a visually interesting title. There's no screen scrolling to be found here. Instead, it's the staggered screen-to-screen transition similar to Zelda 1, or perhaps a more apt comparison would be Vampire Killer on MSX. But that sort of thing makes sense in those cases because of the overhead aspect or because of technical limitations on older computers. In my mind, there's no reason for this sort of approach on side view games on NES, especially those that involve any semblance of platforming. But other than that, Faxanadu sports some drab, dreary, and at times depressing scenery for you to traverse through, intentionally so due to the drab, dreary, and depressing world that you're exploring. The misty portion of the game is a particular high point in visual stage design, not so much in the actual playing of it because there's some horrendous platforming bits here. The rest of the world tree environments are more or less business as usual with some detailed scenery here and there. In a rather nice touch though, your character dons whatever equipment you have presently equipped. So you start off with your bare wares, but as you progress you'll undergo different armors and shields and things before eventually reaching your final playable form. Think Mega Man X and the armor parts that will transform your little blue bomber guy into a slightly less blue bomber. Creature designs, whether they be small fry or the much larger boss monsters, are truly fascinating foes to admire before you eventually slay them. Or they slay you, whatever the case may be. Faxanadu sports some interesting musical bits that I find to be somewhat of a mixed bag, if I'm being honest. Some of the melodies aren't too bad. The main overworld theme that plays for most of the early part of the game at least is a somewhat jaunty little tune. The misty portion of the game has a somewhat dark and ominous theme that's befitting of the environment it plays in. But then there's the tune that plays in shops and taverns that's somewhat repetitive and ear-grating. And the dungeon theme is also somewhat chaotic and not necessarily in the good way either. The sound effects are of the rough ear-piecing variety, not very pleasant in the best of times and downright irritating at worst. And yeah, so this is a hard one for me to gauge because Faxanadu is often considered to be one of the NES greats, beloved by those who have sampled it, and indeed, the game does have a few good ideas going for it that are implemented well enough, and I generally had a good time with it. But there are also aspects to the game that didn't quite work for me, or at all for that matter. In fact, there are portions of the game that only serve to remind me of similar games that have done some of the things that this game does, but does them better. Still, underneath the bits of jank and questionable design choices lies the foundation of a potentially interesting adventure, and if you're willing to put up with some gameplay frustrations early on, there is a good time to be had with Faxanadu. It might not have lived up to the hype, from my vantage point at least, but it is still a perfectly fine little game on NES that's well worth checking out if you enjoy these sorts of games.